Listen, VTEX, it's fully blatant at this point. Why are conjurers still using Elias weapons while mages get to have straight up obby rewards? Like, if you showed this to someone a year ago, they'd brush this off as an exploiter. That's an official spell you put in the game. Warriors get a crumb of movement in sword step, while mages get to summon 50-meter tall obelisks and get blatant copies of fighting style moves. Sometimes I see mages complaining about how it's such a pain to change magics because gotta go into the Dark Sea while the other builds have hot swap weapons. You get to choose your magic at the start of the game. No other build gets to do that. Let's rise up against this blatant favoritism. What's one way we can remedy this versatility creep we see from mages? It's simple.
Use more gun.
More weapons, specifically more weapon skills. If weapon builds had more options for skills spread across more weapon types, then weapon builds could truly fulfill that versatility fantasy, which is that primary appeal anyway. Weapons are also pretty universal, so it isn't just weapon builds that use it. Everyone will benefit. Now, new weapons should be functionally different rather than just the same weapons with stats shifted around. We don't want to add weapons for the sake of bloat. And lastly, I don't want to add slightly different variants of existing weapons. Yes, it's cool if we add falchions and sabers, but they should only exist visually as a part of an existing set, much like how the sideros are considered dual swords. To start things off, I'd like to rant about guns in fiction for a bit. Hold on, hear me out. I am of the opinion that fantasy settings severely underutilize firearms. My hot take is that firearms have as much potential as any other sword or melee weapon we see choked to death in fantasy settings. And I get why we avoid it. In our world, guns are the frontal image of violence. They are at the forefront of wars and atrocities, and we generally know them as tools for the savage, tools for the machine. I understand why a writer would not want to put that in their setting, but I wish these fantasy worlds like Arcane Odyssey would look at them in a vacuum and see them as they truly are, which is just another way to flesh out a world. There are some fascinating pieces out there that don't get the adaptation into our fictional settings as they deserve. Now, how the hell does this relate to my thesis about the Jankfest LEGO game? Well, I think with the Thorn Empire on the horizon, we deserve more guns in Arcane Odyssey. I'm by no means some kind of gun historian, but I was super interested in the description of the flare gun, which sort of implies that Thorn has access to firearms far more advanced than our simple flintlocks and muskets. I'd imagine their technology is closer to what we had in the late 19th century as we move away from black powder. This has some fun implications Arcane Odyssey could do with some cowboy hardware. We know this world has the gunslinger and mafioso fantasy because our stupid little deckhands can emulate them. So my first set of ideas are guns. And the first gun I'd like to talk about, which I think we can mostly agree on, is a revolver. Firstly, I'd like to move away from them being an upgrade from the flintlocks we have. Instead, they should be like the cutlass and sword, just two different categories of weapon with similar skills. I think they should work like the guns we have in shooters today. Fire interrupted and a long reload when out of ammo. That way, it could be more about personal preference, whether you'd want to use a revolver or a flintlock. Then, introduce some unique variants. Here, let me cook up some concepts. The Navy Revolver. Exclusive to high-ranking officers of the Grand Navy, and has a unique skill called Poise, which lets you straighten your stance so that you do more damage and reload faster. The Comet. A revolver that shoots so powerfully it has an inherent scorched status. It's the desert equivalent of the sunken sword, which you find very rarely from digging up treasure in the sand. The next firearm, which would be cool to see in the game, is something we can have now actually. It's the blunderbuss. It's the perfect complement to the musket and flintlock, and it's a little strange we don't have it in the game by now. Shotguns are some of my favorite weapons in any game. I think Arcane Odyssey needs a shotgun of some sort. So, barring the obvious generic versions, like steel and bronze, here are some of my special variations. The Knock Gun. A blunderbuss with 7 barrels. It's incredibly powerful and has recoil so intense, it has movement skills that utilize it. The Coach Gun. This is the more advanced firearms I was talking about. It's what we know as a classic break-action double-barreled shotgun. and it has a unique visual effect depending on the enchant you put on it. If you put brisk on it, it becomes sawed off, to emulate how it got quicker. I'd also like to see an expansion to the rifle category. Again, this is where that thorn technology comes in. My first idea is a lever gun, which I'd imagine to be the standard issue rifle of like either the Thorn military or some kind of Thorn mercenary group, close to like the Summer Company in Deepwoken, I think. I don't know anything about Deepwoken. I think guns are their thing. And the arquebus, which is the standard samurai firearm for the Ryujin Empire. I'd imagine the dynamic between this is that the lever gun is faster, but does less damage, while the arquebus has these big punching attacks. And lastly, to close out the gun section, here's some ideas for specialty firearms. Strength guns. It seems we're going in a direction of strength variants for each weapon, and I think we're going to see strength guns eventually, and they would be awesome to see. So the Mediator. I made a concept for this in a Reddit post you might have seen. It's exactly what it looks like, a cannon ripped off its base. I'd imagine it also function as a sort of shield with weight and passive defense. It should also be distinct from Cannon Fist in that it shouldn't use your ammo, but simply have unique skills like a grape shot blunderbuss move or like a chain shot grab. The Ayla. Essentially a big harpoon gun or massive crossbow like Monster Hunter's bowguns, or the Indigo Elder's like giant crossbow. Now, another weapon class with a lot of potential, which we also know VTech intends on adding in the future, is instruments. I'm personally very curious as to how instruments would be implemented into Arcane Odyssey mechanically. Will they be fully supportive? Will they be weapons themselves? If they were weapons, is the instrument itself the weapon, or is the music? They might even be exclusive to knights and other spirit classes, considering they lack an exclusive hybrid weapon of their own, and it would make sense for weaponized music to be in this godly sort of domain. Personally, I would love to see something similar to Monster Hunter's hunting horn, where its use as a weapon and as a supporting tool is one and the same. Now, what instruments from the real world could we put into Arcane Odyssey, and how would they work? Now, there are some obvious ones, the ones we probably think about for the time period. Instruments like the fife, the war drums, the trumpet. These are militaristic, marching sort of weapons which I feel would fit the Grand Navy quite well. In the case of Caraxi, I think big, cumbersome war drums or bellowing horns would fit that Viking theme perfectly, and play a similar role to those roid potions that they use. There are also instruments we associate with pirates more broadly, like the accordion or the violin. Next are the instruments of the wandering musician, instruments large enough to be primary weapons. These would be the instruments like the lute, or other strumming instruments like guitars. Or maybe a harp or lyre to fit that godly theme with spirit builds. There could also be strength instruments, or instruments that need to be set up to play. For example, a gong, which you could also equip in the siege weapon slot on your ship to buff reloading time or something. You could also have a guzheng, like the assassins from Kung Fu Hustle. You'd carry this huge pack on your back and deploy it to essentially be a mounted weapon of its own. In my concept post, I called it the Gucheng, which is a reference to the song that's played on it in Kung Fu Hustle. Maybe mechanically, string instruments could inflict bleed, percussion instruments could inflict bruised, while horn instruments could inflict a new status effect called deafness, which effectively acts like a temporary limb loss, because it would cause anyone hit by it to cover their ear. At high levels, this might cause bleed. I'd also love a mechanic where your deckhands and crew could carry instruments, maybe something like the relic mechanic we have today. After a long time of sailing during calm weather, maybe they could start playing a shanty, and this could passively heal your crewmates or some other benefit depending on the instrument. It would also be cool if faction-specific instruments could be heard as the alert noise for their ships. Imagine hearing thumping war drums from a Caraxi ship, the Cornu of a Ravenna ship, or the war gong of a Ryujin one. It could be a caravel and I'd still shit myself. That's all for the instruments. Another weapon class I can imagine will be loved by the community are weapons on ropes or chains. On the lighter side, this means something like a whip, Kasarigama, or a Morning Star, all of which I can't help but yearn for on behalf of all your conjurers. These could have the unique feature of being very challenging to use, but incredibly rewarding because they could allow you to control an enemy's movement. But the potential truly shows for warriors and warlords. Imagine something like Kai's chain blades from Kung Fu Panda, or a sectioned staff like Satoru Yoshimura, or a meteor hammer / rope dart, or a big old anchor which you could swing around and drag enemies toward you with. I thought up the anchor in my concept post, and it turned into an actual visual, came up with its lore too, which you can check out in my original post. We also need an expansion to shields. I would love to see the category expanded to just defensive weapons, as essentially weapons that have effects even when not equipped. I'm inspired by antique fencing, where things like bucklers or parrying daggers could serve as a defense. These could offer very little blocking power and very little passive defense, but with insane upsides on parry. For example, bucklers could have a stagger bonus while a parrying dagger could stun, while both could entirely negate incoming damage on a successful parry. Maybe we can introduce a sidearm pistol, baton, or hand axe to go into the offhand and act not as blocking defensive weapons but rather as counterattack weapons. The pistol could do a fixed amount of damage on a parry, while the baton could do attacks scaled with incoming damage. The axe could uniquely counterattack on a ranged parry, etc., etc. Boss weapons are unique in that they often break the mold when it comes to their respective weapon categories. I'd imagine there's room for there to be some truly unique boss weapons in the future of the game, and here are some of my ideas, some of which are taken from my original post. In the future, our protagonist could be embroiled in like a mafia conflict. Maybe they have weapons in line with that general theme of secrecy and underhandedness. For example, an umbrella gun which can fold up to become a shield, or a cane sword which is concealed in plain sight. Mercenary characters like the ones we see in the mini-bosses of Maine or the Crone could each have gimmicks that adhere to a theme, like the wandering musician I mentioned a while ago, who may have made the deal with the gods for his incredible playing skill, and we follow them and spar with them as they travel and make a name for themselves. Maybe they use a banjo like the heroic ideal of a blues musician. Maybe there's a detective agency sent by some suspicious or hostile kingdom to shadow our protagonists, and the lead guy uses a shillelagh. Prosthetic weapons too. A hook arm, a musket leg, a forearm blade. There could be a boss that mirrors a sort of grim reaper and thus uses a massive scythe. The blade of this scythe could fold in on itself to turn into a form that has polearm abilities, while its normal form would have huge sweeping attacks. Shit, if we're on the topic of hybrid and transforming weapons, we're in a really ripe time period and setting. We could have gun swords, knuckle pistols, axe rifles. I've gone on for long enough. I promise I'm almost done. Thank you for hearing me out. This is going to be a smaller section to just rapid fire additions I'd like to see in existing categories. I'd like them to appear more as visual representations rather than bespoke weapons, but obviously the more options we have to be cool as weapon builds, the more we can spit in the face of those coddled mages. I'd love to see scimitars, odachi, wakizashi, guandao or naginata, wick guns, wheel-lock pistols and rifles, dagger axes or billhooks, revolver rifles, hand mortars, hand cannons, macuajitos, cavalry and fencing stations.